So I'm embarrassed to admit that Kanthan Pillay has been on the show. He's been part of the Burning Platform for years now. I've known him for years. There's so many things I just do not know, which is dreadful. So I'm glad to actually have you in here and be able to tell a little bit about your story, because it's a very interesting and quite complex, just like you, story. So it's a pleasure to have you in here and focus on you for a change instead of all the issues in the world.
It's fascinating because I think for the first time I don't need to have notes and a laptop in front of me.
No, you're just going to be talking about
I
yourself.
just make up stuff as I go along.
Which you don't normally do. And people project their stuff onto you when you talk about things on the Burning Platform, for example. If you have an opinion about Russia or China, or it must be because you're a big Russia supporter or you're a big India or China supporter. It's bizarre. But you...
And now suddenly I'm an Israel supporter.
Oh,
there
yeah,
you go.
yeah, of course. But you're not afraid of any of that anyway. You could care less.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So listen, tell me about the family, because your mother was a member of parliament. Is that the tricameral parliament?
No, well, she accidentally ended up in the tricameral parliament. Yes, that's right, because she used to be Director General of Department of Education. That was
under the old regime.
Under the old, so it was. Remember, at the time, it was Indian Affairs.
Yes,
and so she was heading up education at the time. And you might remember there was this corruption scandal that happened in, I think it was called the House of Delegates, was the Indian Chamber of Parliament.
Right.
And there was Rajbansi's lot, and de Klerk basically fired Rajbansi's cabinet. And then he needed, people to start running stuff. And so he put in my mother as Minister of Indian Education.
Wow.
So she got drafted into it. And then when the 1994 elections came along, he promptly put her onto the National Party slate. And so she was a National Party member of Parliament.
But
it's been a source of contention in my family for years that I
didn't
vote for my mother. Yes.
Right, you didn't vote for your mother. You were basically persona non grata to the National Party.
No, actually,
you were in the struggle, for heaven's sake.
Yes, but surprisingly, I actually had a reasonably good relationship with Rolf Mayer in particular, and so de Klerk was actually quite civil in terms of dealing with me. Tony Leon far less so.
But this is in the 80s, and I mean, you were studying.
Yes.
At the University of Durban Westville.
Yes,
and you were expelled.
I was expelled there
because you were politically dangerous.
Look, I don't want to make that sound bigger than it actually is, because there were a lot of us who were expelled back then.
Yes, but student politics is where all politics starts.
Mm-hmm.
And you were a real rebel rouser. I mean, you wrote stuff, you said stuff, not unlike what you do now.
No, very much so. And the interesting thing is, if I look back at stuff that I've written back then, so my first byline was in 1980, after I got kicked out of university. I became a freelance journalist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my views have actually not changed during the course of time, well, apart from economics.
But you also, I mean, there's a lot of music in the family too. Your father was a classical Indian vocalist, right? And you've got pop stars in the family.
I do indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Creason.
Creason is my first cousin. Right. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
I saw him at your birthday a while ago, and I didn't know there was a connection. Then I went, but obviously there's a connection here. Yeah. So, I mean, it's very... Also, another interesting thing about you that I got in my notes, these copious notes that the producers give me, you were at high school in Bangalore.
Yes. So, again, that was because of student activism. So back in 1974, you might remember, well, there was a sequence of events that affected the subcontinent.
Kanthan, I wasn't here in 1974.
Well, essentially in 1974, there was the coup in Portugal.
Right.
And a result of the coup in Portugal, suddenly you had Mozambique declaring independence, you had Angola declaring independence, and of course there was Frelimo at the time.
Yeah.
That was fighting, and there was a Frelimo rally that was organized in Durban. That was at Curry's Fountain, which was the playground for my school. I was at Gandhi Desai, and of course we got swept up in that. And my mother at the time said to me, "Well, if you stay here, you're going to keep getting caught up in all of this rubbish. And why don't I send you to boarding school in India?
Which is such an interesting point of view to take, because most parents would be, oh, just behave, stop causing trouble.
Yes.
And even though your mother was in government, so to speak.
No, she wasn't at the time.
She wasn't at the time.
No, at the
and
time.
she didn't have political ambitions at that point.
She never had any political ambitions, actually.
But still irritated as a mother that her son should be causing trouble, or proud of you. Which was it?
I think it was more a question of her getting scared that I might get sucked into the destructive maw of losing perspective.
Well, you can joke about it, but
Yes.
there were actual dangers involved then. I
Yes.
mean, we've got to
Well,
remember there were states of emergency.
Look, understand, I was 12 going on 13 at the time. So,
Jeez, that's a hell of a time to be politically conscientized.
yeah.
I don't think I was politically aware at 12, 13.
Well, you have to understand that I had, in my family, I had lots of people who were actually, politically active. So, one of my cousins and her husband needed to go into exile on an exit permit at the time. Another one of my cousins was actually arrested at the Frelimo rally. And, of course, that's where the likes of Sats Cooper, Trini Moodley, Terra Lakota, all of them went to Robben Island precisely for being at that rally.
Sure.
So they were the youngest crop of people to go across there. And I think from my mother's perspective, there was the sense of, yes, there's, real potential danger of, kids getting, well, firstly beaten up by the cops, so that was the first thing that one wanted
because
to
the
avoid.
cops were violent. I mean, South Africa's
Sure.
got a history of the cops being violent. But does it irritate you? Because I know you now, and people assume all kinds of things about your politics now, because you're a capitalist, because you're more conservative than you are liberal in very many instances. I mean, you're still socially very liberal, I think it's fair to say. But
Well,
people,
in the classically liberal sense,
yeah,
yes.
but people, if you ask them about Kanthan's politics and they know even a little bit about you, they go, oh, well, he must be an arch conservative. And then you've got this history and this background, and it's exhausting actually to keep explaining this to people. And you don't have to run around with your credentials.
No, but I think that people have this desire to put you into a particular box without, just simply based on the fact that you offer an opinion on something very specific. Now, if I look in terms of my personal belief system, I've got a lot of classically liberal values. So, I'm a freedom of speech absolutist,
Sure.
for example. I don't believe that there should be such a category as hate speech. But you
Very
can say things that
controversial.
are pretty much hateful. And if you call for someone to be killed, well, that's incitement. There's a separate charge around that. I'm very much against the death penalty. I'm very much in favor of gay rights.
Yeah.
All of that type of stuff. But
What has changed since you were a teenager and a guy in his 20s who was very politically aware, outspoken, and all the rest of it? Nothing's changed in terms of the outspokenness, but your position on things?
I guess the economic perspective is the single thing that
I saw
basically
such a
changed.
funny tweet the other day, or it was a post on Instagram of a tweet. Someone said, I watched this girl getting her first paycheck, and you could almost see the socialism ebbing out of her veins.
Uh-huh.
Is that what happened?
Well, no, it wasn't really that. It was at the point at which I realized that we can have all of these, relatively cool ideas about, we're all equal and we all have the same rights. But damn it, we're not all as competent as each other.
Uh-huh.
And that becomes the fundamental point of differentiation, because you can all be lumped into the same group, and you ostensibly have the same background, and you treated pretty much as equals. But at the end of the day, you don't actually have the same capacity to do stuff.
Well, socialism thinks we're all the same, and if we're not, then we just need to change the system, because then we can make the outcomes the same.
Very much so. But the point at which you ask any parent, do you want to be treated by a doctor of your race, or do you want to be treated by the best possible doctor?
Yeah, they'll
and
choose the
and, and
best possible
suddenly
doctor.
they're
Doesn't matter how political they are.
absolutely.
Best doctor. But interesting that you found your way to Princeton again because you were kind of trying to get out of the country. It was
That's a fascinating story, and it's
yeah.
entirely.
I mean, first of all, it's interesting you're at Princeton, and even though you've mentioned it to me before, when I found out what you were doing there and what you studied there and what you guys managed to do in terms of advancing computer technology. The exact thing that you did, and it was fluid dynamics, computational
CFD,
fluid
yeah.
dynamics.
Yes.
I mean, we'll get to that in a second. So tell me about how you ended up at Princeton.
Well, so of course I was a university dropout out here. Well, expelled from Durban Westville, and
Not a dropout. You expelled. It's
all right,
different to a dropout.
Okay, sure, all right, okay. Expelled.
I
from
was a dropout.
Yeah, so expelled from Durban Westville, and in early '85. You had USALEP, the United States South Africa Leadership Exchange Program,
Yeah.
and they set up something with Boston University to essentially provide a very intensive training program for South African journalists who'd never had any formal training. So there was an entire group of us who ended up at Wits Business School for that period with these professors from Boston University who were teaching us for that 6-week program. And so we went through that 6-week program. And at the end of that 6-week program, the professor was heading up the program. His name was Henk Lebrie. It was actually Henry Grattan Lebrie, but Americans affectations called himself Henk. But he calls me into his office, and he says, "Look, I've had you here for 6 weeks, and I've taught you absolutely nothing because you know all this stuff already." And I just kind of shrugged, and I said, "Well, okay." I still had fun, it was good. I enjoyed it, and he pushes a pile of papers across to me, and I say, "What's this?" He says, "I want you to fill these out. These are endorsements for scholarships in the U.S."
Wow,
and
that's amazing.
And I said, "Well, what the hell?" And I went through the process of filling out the paperwork, and then come 1986 with the state of emergency. And, there were cops knocking on my door at 3 a.m. Fortunately, I was not at home at the time. I was staying illegally at William Saunderson Mayer's home, living in his basement. So, the security branch was knocking at my door looking for me. And guess what? I end up with acceptances to about 5 universities in the U.S.
But you didn't leave because you wanted to go to the US. I mean, that may have been part of it, but you also had to get out.
Well, I had to get out, and this was a godsend because it suddenly pitched up, from nowhere,
and scholarships too. So you didn't have to worry that
exactly,
your parents would have to pay for this because it might have been very difficult.
It wasn't a question of my parents because I was basically employed and paying my own way from the time I was.
But
19
you wouldn't have
years
been
old.
able to afford it necessarily.
No, absolutely not.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me what computational fluid dynamics are.
Well, it basically is, it deals with flow, so just about everything that involves, an object moving through the atmosphere or moving through water, it's flow.
So it's not liquid drives or any of that stuff. It's actually about fluids. So it's physics.
Well, yes, yeah. So basically, an aircraft wing involves fluid dynamics, and so very specifically, the design in terms of aircraft wings requires a fair amount of computation because you do a combination in terms of how long the wings need to be, how wide they need to be, how much the flaps should be. There's a lot of computation that goes into that. And the particular computation that we used to do at the time, we used to run on these silicon graphics machines, which were the fastest machines that we had at the time. You might remember Jurassic Park. The animations that were done for that were done on silicon graphics machines, and we were using pretty much those same machines at Princeton. And then Intel pitched up, and they had um, this processor, which was the i860 processor, which at the time,
Intel Hypercube.
yes, well, at the time, in terms of floating point operations, was roughly half the speed of a Cray YMP, which was the fastest supercomputer at the time.
When is this? 90?
1989, 1990, around about that time frame.
Okay.
And so they pitched up, and they essentially gave us this box, and they had 32 of these chips in a particular box, and they said, look, we've designed this thing, and we don't know what to do with it. So, what can you guys do with it? So the particular runs that we used to do at the time, and a lot of the work that we were doing there, this was the program in Applied and Computational Math at Princeton. A lot of the work we were doing was for the U.S. Department of Defense.
Yeah.
Because, it was they'd come to us and they'd say, we'd want you to run this computation because it's a submarine fin.
Right.
And then we'd take a look at it and we'd say, no, this is actually an aircraft design, but that's okay. We get it. We'd run the computation, but it would take like 2 weeks for the entire sequence to run because it was very intensive and, you had to keep crunching the numbers.
And the computing power then was not as compact or
nowhere near as
incredible as what we use now.
Absolutely,
I mean, computers were very rudimentary things, and I mean, people like Ray Kurzweil at MIT were using things that took up a whole floor.
Yeah, very much so. I mean,
in the 80s, that was like the big.
Well, to run the IBM 3081 mainframe, which was the biggest thing that we had on campus at the time, it was bigger than this house, the floor that we used to run it on. But so they pitched up. So what we figured out was that we could kind of compartmentalize the way in which we were doing the calculation. So if you think of an aircraft wing as an example, and essentially what you're trying to do is to calculate the flow over segments of the wing at a time. And so we then partitioned the wing into separate segments and ran each of those computations on individual processes and then lump them together.
Do you have like a wind tunnel that you would test these things out on?
No, it's all entirely theoretical.
All theoretical.
Yes, so because they're all known quantities. So
you wouldn't build the thing necessarily, but you do the science for them, and then they would build
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
you weren't involved in the manufacture or the actual practical testing or any of that stuff.
No, it's fun in theory.
But you'd say this angle would produce this amount of lift.
Yes.
This is where the airflow would go.
Well, it's lift, it's turbulence, it's
sure.
All sorts of efficiency, the amount of power.
And when people think of aerodynamics, they don't think of fluid because we immediately assume, well, it's a gas. But at those speeds and temperatures, very often gases behave exactly like liquids, and in fact, the effect that's produced is precisely the same.
Sure. And so essentially, what we were able to do using the hypercube is that we were able to slash the computation time from 2 weeks down to 2 days.
Wow.
Which meant that we then ended up beating out the rest of the country for getting, at the time, a U.S. Department of Defense grant for $14 million, which was a fair whack of money at the time.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so Professor Stephen Orzak, who was head of our department at the time, was pretty smug about it. He's dead now, lovely guy.
Well, what's happened to tertiary education in the U.S. since you left?
Oh, geez. Look, I think
it's become a disaster.
The thing is,
I don't think they teach anything like computational fluid dynamics anymore. They just teach you gender studies and other grievance studies.
Look,
not so much at Princeton.
Yeah, I think that you'll find that one of the major issues right now is that a lot of the actual computational power is no longer at the universities themselves. So
sure.
At Princeton at the time, we had the John von Neumann Supercomputer Center at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, which actually had a Cray YMP, and
wow.
you had to submit applications in order to get your code to run out there, and so forth. So our friend from Beautiful Mind,
Yes, there
Yes.
was an actual person.
Yes,
The,
yeah.
the movie was based. Russell Crowe played the character.
Yes, yeah.
It's this mathematical
Yeah,
genius.
Nash. Yeah. So he was
Nash, that's
yeah,
his name.
so-
And
so
he was a real guy.
He was a real guy. He used to come to the Princeton Computer Center, and he used to give me his code to run on punch cards.
Really?
Yeah, and I used to tell him, we actually have interactive terminals where you can
And he
run
didn't want to
No,
hear
no,
it.
he didn't want anything because he said correctly. Because they're actually inefficient. They're taking up computing resources, and everything I've got here is on my punch cards. And so I'd say, sure, I'd go load it up for it.
So when the movie came out, you must have been quite thrilled. You said to people, I worked with this guy.
I only found out about the movie coming out because Ed Milches, who worked with me at the computer center, then sent me frantic messages on Facebook to say, "Hey, look, our old friend now has a movie made about him."
That's amazing.
Yeah,
What a story, huh?
loads of fun. Yeah.
And the research and the work that you did there then got you a job in, of all places, Sardinia.
Well, there was a visiting Italian scientist
Yeah.
who was seconded to PACM at the time, and he saw the stuff that I was doing, and
It's like, why you not come to Sardinia? That's what he said.
well,
It's an exact quote. I've got it here.
Pretty much something like that. Look, I had a choice at the time because I got job offers from Wall Street because. I think Salomon Brothers offered me a $40,000 signing bonus at the time.
Wow, that would have been a good.
to go and
so,
work
as an
Wall Street.
arch capitalist, which I know you are,
No, but I
How
wasn't.
could you turn
I wasn't
that
a-
down?
I wasn't. Look, I mean, it was a toss-up between
science.
go.
What's wrong with you?
No, go and work Wall Street, or go to a Mediterranean island that I know absolutely nothing about. But
You could have, for all we know, you could have come back to South Africa and bought 3/4 of the country if you'd gone to Wall Street then.
yeah, but on the other hand, I'd probably end up like David Sachs and never coming back.
That's also true. And you did, when you eventually came back, and I don't mean to skirt past Sardinia, because I'm sure you had a lovely time there, and I'm sure it wasn't boring, and I'm sure that you learned plenty, and you also met fascinating people. But to skip ahead, you did come back to South Africa, and you decided straight away, I'm staying.
Yes.
I mean, things had changed considerably since when you left.
Yes. Well, I came back December '93, and
Then things were really kicking
yeah,
off.
and so I just went back and said, guys, I'm going to be out of here. Here's my 3 months notice, and
All right, so talk to me about your perception of South Africa in '93 and
think-
why you wanted to come back and what you saw happening, because it was, I mean, that whole period from 1990 until probably 95, 6 was the most exciting period in South Africa in terms of everything changing. The
Sure.
economy, obviously the politics, society itself was changing a lot. There were so many amazing moving parts all at once. It would have been very hard for anyone, especially if they were South African, like you, to say, no, I'd rather be somewhere else.
so a couple of things happened on that particular trip that were kind of juxtaposed with each other. The one is that the RVB were having a march from the Voortrekker Monument.
So you joined them immediately. Well, that's what people say. That right winger, you must have.
I don't think I would have passed the physical back then either.
Yeah, no, for sure.
But so
They were planning a march from the Voortrekker Monument
yes,
to where?
somewhere in Pretoria. But I happened
They,
to be,
they
I
were
ha-
notoriously bad at marches and coups.
Yeah, so I happened to be in Pretoria at on that particular day because my then wife, as in mother of my eldest daughter,
Yes.
was studying at UNISA at the time, and so we figured we'd just pitch up there and actually submit the applications in person. And then as we were driving past, EOFIS, and we see the RV beer guys.
How many of them were there at that point?
Well, that wasn't the issue as much as the fact that they were all decked out. They had Ossewa, literally, and they were in ox wagons and marching along. And then they would, and then there was the Kapi Commando people, I mean,
the old
decked
ladies
out
with cuppies, yeah.
yeah, with their bonnets and like it was a throwback to the previous century. And then I pitch up at UNISA, and there are hundreds upon hundreds of people in this queue, but the overwhelming majority of the people there are young black people. And guess what? UNISA had actually anticipated that there was going to be this type of queue, and they'd actually laid out enough chairs to accommodate everyone. So there was a line sneaking all the way outside to the admissions place. And it was
Imagine
just
how angry the Avia Beer would have been.
and it was just incredibly quick and efficient.
Avia Beer would have
I
been
was
so
saying,
cross, though, if they'd
so
seen
on the
that.
one hand, you've got 100 years in the past, and then the future of
Yeah.
the country. And I was saying, no, I got to be part of this. And it was really that simple. I said, I'm not going to miss this.
Yeah,
I need to be back.
it must have been fantastically exciting. And South Africa was a burgeoning place at that point. And the focus of the world was on us, right? So, okay, you get back to South Africa, but now you're a scientist, actually, at this point. And what kind of career prospects did you have? Because media wasn't on the cards for you at that point.
Well, actually, I went right back to media, but I went back to them
Because you were writing, sorry, let's just fill in. You were writing as a student, and even before then, and you actually gave lectures at Princeton in South African history.
Yes.
So that's no small feat for anyone at that period of their life to be lecturing other students at Princeton about.
It was useful because of the fact that the crop of academics that, and remember, we're talking close to 40 years ago now.
Yeah.
They were an entirely different batch, and it was such an exciting place to be. Free speech was absolutely the norm in that place, and the discussions would be absolutely robust. But it really was the type of thing where they would say, "Look, hey, we've got a guy right here who's got first-hand experience on the ground,
Let's pull him on.
and we're going to pull him in, and we're going to actually have conversations and get the students to engage with the."
Okay, but let's just stop with free speech for a second, because it's something that I often get into arguments or discussions with friends and enemies of mine about. You said you're a free speech absolutist, which is a position that many have said is an untenable one. There's always going to be a limit to everything. Something without limits isn't worth anything. Why do you say you're an absolutist?
Well,
because it's a position I've occupied before, and I've kind of ameliorated that somewhat.
So the first thing is that I'm very clear that words are not violence.
I agree with you.
Okay, violence is violence.
Yes.
Right.
Agreed.
Hurt feelings are never going to be the same as actually getting a snot clap.
Yes.
Okay, I don't care who you are.
Yes.
And having been on the receiving end of snot claps myself, and lots of verbal abuse, I can tell you that yes, there's a definite difference between the two. In the cases where speech might potentially be dangerous, okay, so clearly if you're with a crowd of people and you say that person is an impimpi, go and kill him, that's not a free speech issue, okay?
No.
Yeah, that's actually incitement to violence. It's an entirely different category.
But there's already a category for that. We don't need to create a hate speech category.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So people bring up the old chestnut about, shouting fire in a crowded theater. You've heard that one many times.
Yeah.
And again, that's reckless endangerment. There's a separate category for that. You don't need to actually police it. At the point at which you tell lies about someone,
There's defamation.
There's defamation.
Yeah.
So where is the point at which you need to actually be curtailing speech other than to protect someone's feelings?
But Kanthan, people's feelings are very important. We've been led to believe over the last 10 years they are the most important thing, and how someone feels about the world is their truth.
Sure. And, this comes back to religion, doesn't it? Because it is, fundamentally that. All religions are variations on my imaginary friend is bigger than yours. And the point at which you have someone like me who's atheist, I'm very respectful of people's spaces, but I'm certainly going to speak up to my beliefs when I want to, and people's feelings are going to be hurt as a result of that. And I think that makes for a good society.
Have you ever heard a good argument against free speech?
No, I haven't.
And
because in every case, I will always turn around and say, actually, there's a different way of dealing with this.
And have you ever heard from anyone who you thought was infringing on your free speech? And have you ever had situations in your adult life where you had that freedom of speech curtailed, either within the law or by agents who actively want to change the law?
See, the interesting thing, we just go back to the apartheid era for a while. And the Nats used to say back then that there was absolute freedom of speech in South Africa. And to a large extent, they were correct. The problem was, under the National Party, is that there was freedom of opinion, but there was not freedom of facts.
Right.
So you were not allowed to spread truthful information if that truthful information was censored. Okay, so for example,
They didn't like it.
yeah, so you couldn't write anything in terms of the Police Act. You couldn't write anything about police unless you got the police to comment on it and gave them equal space. That was written into the into the
right
Act.
of reply. It's more of a journalist thing than it is
Well,
a free
it
speech
wasn't
thing.
exactly a right of reply. It was, but it had a chilling effect on. So even if I saw a policeman shooting a kid in the back, I still had to go through a process of getting a quote from the police, which frequently would say, "No, it didn't happen."
Yeah.
In the
Especially
case
in those days.
yeah, in the case of the Department of Defense, you were not allowed to write anything about the Department of Defense unless they said that it actually happened.
It was a security risk.
It was a security risk, absolutely. So you were not allowed to quote anything from any prisoner. So I grew up my entire life. I had no idea what Nelson Mandela looked like because it was illegal to have pictures of
None of
Nelson
us
Mandela.
did. And you couldn't Google him.
Yes. So, and the only point at which we suddenly became aware of what Nelson Mandela looked like was during the state of emergency. The Bureau for Information put out a publication which had a list of dangerous people, and it had a picture of Nelson Mandela in it. And in terms of the emergency laws, anything that the Bureau for Information put out, you were able to publish. And suddenly, all of us in the country saw what Nelson Mandela looked like for the first time.
Yeah.
Ever,
I remember the fascination even when people were, including me, in 1990, watching him being released from Victor Verster. No, it was from, Victor Verster.
It was Victor Verster, yes.
And the cameras were jostling to get that first shot of, and this stately gray-haired man walked out of there, and I thought, wow, that's the most famous man in the world.
Yes.
And
So,
no one had seen him in person with the
So
exception of his guards.
I was watching that from my apartment at Princeton, and we had a whole bunch of South Africans that were there, and we were all glued to the TV. Fascinating stuff.
Okay, so before we get into the media stuff, on this freedom of speech thing, because you're an atheist, there tends to be, and I'm not being unfair to atheists, being one myself, but there tends to be this God-shaped hole in many atheists, and they fill it with things like free speech or secular humanism, whatever that is, or they fill it with, the idea of many of them have replaced the hole that religion supposedly leaves for some with politics. We see it in the world today. There's lots of leftism, which is actually just a craving in adolescent souls for values, purpose, meaning, something greater than yourself. And sometimes, whether it's wokeness or whether it's campaigning for Ukraine or whatever it might be, the people who put flags on their profile pictures in order to feel part of something. You don't feel that perhaps things like free speech have taken an almost sacred place in your worldview?
Well, I don't think so. I think it's not something that I think about on a daily basis. So it's stuff that you kind of believe in. But I suppose it's the difference between someone who's, let's say, born to Catholicism and so they go to church, but they actually don't think about the church, as opposed to someone who's converted and they suddenly become quite obsessed with it. So I think free speech and liberal values are just it's something that's ingrained.
And where do you think that came from with you?
I think
Your parents?
Well, a lot of it came from the fact that I read a lot as a kid, and so there were a lot of books that I read that taught things like self-reliance and the
Terrible stuff like that, like accountability.
accountability, the importance of good character, honesty,
No.
all of that kind of stuff. And
All that boring stuff that makes the world work.
yes,
So what's happened with society where those things have become distasteful to so many? Everybody is desperate to be at the top of the victim hierarchy. People are desperate to not be responsible for their own decisions. Everything else must be blamed for all the ills in your life, and you must never take credit for any of the successes because that's pure luck.
I think a lot of
Is it generational?
I don't think it's as much generational as much as the fact that we've increasingly relied upon the state to take responsibility for things that when I was a kid, we were told were things that you did as an individual. So the idea that the state needed to provide for you was never something that ever entered my landscape at all.
Well, the state, when you were growing up, especially did not care about people of color.
Sure,
which you would have fallen into the category
but
of,
to
right?
look to a larger, it never was about that either. Look, sure
No,
enough,
but it becomes a talking point today, and I know you don't make a big thing about it, but in those days,
yes,
there wasn't the scope of possibility that there is now.
that's correct. But at the same time, the fact that you didn't have anything to rely on meant that your options were pretty much infinite, because that meant that you had to pretty much build whatever you wanted to by
Don't
yourself.
spoil this. I'm building a victim narrative for you, and you're chopping it apart here. Stop it. Why are you being so anti-left?
Well, it's because you're white and you can't possibly understand my pain.
Well, exactly. Your lived experience, right?
Uh-huh.
I find this country is a fascinating place. So many of the things that are good in the world can claim to have some sort of origin here, including our very species, right? But so many of the worst things, like if I think back to Roads Must Fall and that whole movement and how it's turned into essentially Black Lives Matter and this whole anti-colonial decolonizing project all over the world. South Africa has some things to answer for, as much as we have a contribution that we've made. And our contribution goes beyond Mandela and peaceful transition and all of that stuff. What do you think of, and what do people ask you about when you talk to them about being South African?
It's been a while since I've had that particular conversation.
Well, because people don't care anymore.
Yeah, so
right?
There was a period during the 90s, and I wrote about it at the time. About
it was so
how
cool to be us.
It was so cool, and I said at the time, so when Mandela was stepping down in '99, and I took my newspaper column and I wrote an open letter to him, and the open letter was basically describing how cool it was to travel the world as a South African, carrying your South African passport as a badge of honor.
Because it says in there, in the name of the president, and we happen to have had the world's most famous and probably the most morally...
certainly in terms of leaders of the last century, yeah, very much so.
Yeah, and I would say that also we had the ability to be friends with everybody. But we were friends with people who were actually enemies with each other, and we could be friendly with both.
The thing that fell apart was when we stopped being the Rainbow Nation and we suddenly started introducing apartheid in the form of black economic empowerment, and that suddenly started dividing the nation right down. Because remember, up until the time that happened, I mean, we were a winning nation.
You're going straight for the controversies here.
Yeah,
You're not even giving me room to just garden around the edges in this story. But okay, is that where we? So BEE is one of the places we went wrong.
No, it is the place.
It's
where
the
we went
place
wrong because the point of then dividing us as a nation,
race-based policy,
race-based policies. Because up until that time, we were South Africans first and foremost. And now suddenly there was this reintroduction of a pecking order, which has gotten progressively worse.
It has.
And
absolutely.
And there is nothing in that narrative that actually gives us any incentive for pulling together. And you can't actually build a nation unless you at least singing from the same hymn sheet on what it means to be a citizen of that particular country. So this is the problem that the United States has right now. The country has completely lost its way. So, it used to be that it was truth, justice, and the American way, and everyone aspired to those particular things. Now, there's no longer that concept of truth and justice.
Okay, but then to bring it back to you, because I think you and I will have a tendency to talk about things like that because they interest us more than the personal. But I do want, if nothing else in this interview, to at least attempt for us to have a discussion about your personality, the things you care about, family, all of those things. Is it important for you, and do you consider your identity as an Indian South African to be relevant to discussions about being South African or about your place in the world or anything else?
Look, it's not a defining point in the sense of something that I actually think about. So they're very definite.
It just is.
So yeah, it just is. So there's some things that that are cultural, that are kind of innate to me that I've basically grown up with, and to a large extent they do end up
like your cooking. I can attest to.
Yes,
I can.
Yeah, and that's something that runs through my family.
And you take cooking very, very seriously.
Yes, and the reason why I take it so seriously is because, I spent a lot of my life poor, but I always had a fondness for good things, and I said, well, one of the best ways I can get those things is to learn how to make them for myself, so that I don't need to pitch up at very expensive restaurants. But so things that Indian South Africans do. One is that we prize education.
Yep.
More than just about anything else.
Yeah.
So that's very much a defining point. And I often tell my fellow South Africans, if you spend more money on funerals than you do on school fees, maybe you need to be shifting that cultural perspective, because I'm very clear that that is a plus in terms of what my culture actually believes in. That,
and the other thing that I think is distinctive about you as an individual is that because you're irreligious and people always assume Indian South Africans have to be Hindu or Muslim, that kind of breaks the mold as well.
Yes, except
you get a bit of a thrill out of breaking the mold.
Again, this is something that I tell people.
Do you enjoy breaking the mold?
But it's not really breaking the mold, because Hinduism allows you to be an atheist.
Okay, yeah.
It's ingrained. It's ingrained in
that.
the belief system, and the belief system is that you can. There are basically three paths to self-actualization, and the first is service to your fellow human beings. The second is service to God, and then the third is actually going and meditating up in the Himalayas and
more
and that kind of
stuff.
But there is nothing in terms of Hinduism that says that you need to believe in any particular deity or worship any particular deity. I mean, that's something that's there, but it's not a requirement. And also, there's nothing prescriptive about it. So there's nothing in Hinduism that says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, all of that stuff. It does say that there are consequences. So if you kill, the consequences are that it's actually going to affect you.
Were you raised Hindu?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And look, I still take part in all of the festivals. I sing along.
I do
with the
Christmas,
songs. But at the same time, I went to an Islamic kindergarten when I was a kid. And so we would all line up in the morning, and we would recite the Declaration of Faith. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and so forth. And then I went to a Catholic primary school and Anglican high school.
This is why I ask if you like breaking the mold, because all of these experiences, while some of them you didn't choose, they were chosen for you, I think it gives you a richness of experience which, if you are the stereotype, and there are a lot of South Africans who fall into stereotypes, I sometimes think about the way I say things or do things, and I go, that's the kind of thing a comedian would make fun of, because it's so South African. But with your international experience, the way you were raised, these different schools that you went to, that creates a much fuller person by the time you get to 25 than if you just do the same thing, you're only in the same neighborhood, you go to the school that people would expect you to go to, you're around the people would expect you to be influenced by.
Sure.
Are your children being raised that way?
I try as much as possible, to expose them to a wide variety of stuff. And look, that has its pros and it has its cons as well, because it can actually end up being a pretty lonely place, because people want to fit you into particular boxes wherever you happen to be, and even though you can actually have fun, hanging out and discussing, particular things within a very narrow cultural context, if it doesn't actually define you, if it's not your be-all and end-all, it can actually be quite kind of frustrating. And, hence my saying it becomes a bit of a lonely space. When people start talking about, issues of the world from a relatively narrow perspective, and you've actually got this very broad sense of everything that's happening around, and do you really want to spend like the next 5 years trying to explain to them, well, actually, the stuff that you believe in is not necessarily the way you think it should be working. More often than not, it's a lot easier to just, kind of smile and keep quiet.
A bigger frame of reference, maybe.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so the other thing that I'm kind of obsessed with at the moment that I think you might have some wisdom to share on is the idea of being a generalist or a specialist. And I think both have tremendous value. We need a specialist when it comes to, mechanical engineering, for example. You don't want some guy who's just making it up as he goes. But generalists are tremendously valuable in society these days, people who know a little bit about many things. Would you categorize yourself as the former or the latter? And what do you see in the difference and the value of the two?
I think that, one can be a generalist, but whenever I have something that piques my interest, I try to end up being a bit of a specialist in it. So we've had similar discussions around things like, well, at the point at which suddenly solar energy becomes a thing, I go out and I study this stuff to a great extent because, I want to find out, how does this stuff work? What are the technologies that are actually involved? What's the cost-benefit analysis that one applies to this kind of stuff? And so, yes, it is a very broad perspective, but one needs to be able to speak with authority.
Yeah.
On, so you can't just, be sitting back and saying, I know how to make a plane take off. You also need to know how to land it. But
you'd hope so.
Yeah, but I do want. So on my very first car, I rebuilt the engine myself, mainly because I couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it. It was a Peugeot 504, and the essentially the sleeve seals had worn out, and so it was leaking water into the cylinders. And so I had an uncle who was a mechanic who.
But you see,
basically allowed me to.
This is why I ask you the question. It's not by mistake. I know this about you, that you'll learn to take the engine apart.
Yes.
Where most people will just call the mechanic.
Right.
and you've run an election campaign because you found out what you think we need to do to fix this country. You've even written a book about it.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And I know you've done the research. You've looked
Yes.
at all the systems, and you've decided this is the best, and I'll explain to you why. And it's all very practical. You're not trying to start a new ideology. You're a very practical guy.
Yes.
This comes from stripping engines and learning how to do computational fluid dynamics.
Very much so. So I think that a lot of people try to, they get a bit derisive about stuff. They say, jack of all trades and master of none.
I hate that saying.
And,
do you hate it as well?
Well, it actually, I think to a large extent, people do that to make up for their particular shortcomings. because a lot of people are very specialized in terms
Yeah.
of what they know, and
Also, our
firstly,
education system, and you spoke about the importance of education to Indian South African families, but everybody in South Africa thinks the best thing you can do is become a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, which are
yes,
very specialized things.
yes.
I mean, if you've got a heart surgeon, you want them to be a specialist heart surgeon. You don't want them to be someone who also does carpentry and a little bit of haberdashery over the weekends.
So the guy who was my my GP at Princeton all those years ago, his name was John Seed. He's a doctor,
Yes.
and so at kind of the end of my second year, John Seed took 2 years off, went back to college, and got an engineering degree. And at the time, he was
Wow.
in his 50s. And it was just something that he wanted to do because he wanted to learn more about very specific stuff. And I think that that's the type of mentality that those of us who commit ourselves to never saying, all right, I'm not learning anything from now on. I've learned everything there is to learn. And, people who work in very particular careers, they end up being in that space where, if you're an ophthalmic surgeon, for example, I guess the stuff that you will learn is when new pieces of equipment come along. But, there's only so much you can learn about that.
I mark, and I don't know if you'd agree with this definition. I mark intelligence not by how much people know, but by how much they want to know. And the moment you decide, no, I know enough now, and I can't imagine a person doing that, then I think you are so full of hubris, you're just ready for the fall.
Yeah, see, one of the useful things for me is that I've ended up swapping careers so often. And
Jack of all trades, master of none.
yeah,
I know what people say.
but you see, the useful thing about that is that you end up going into something where you literally know nothing about it.
Yes.
But everyone understands the basics of how a business works. So, we speak about spaza
You say
shops.
everyone does, but I don't think so.
Well, we speak about spaza shops often, and again, people, speak about spaza shops with derision. But
Yes.
the fact of the matter is that a spaza shop encapsulates the essence of what's needed to run a business. And more often than not, if you take a look at spaza shops, more often than not, they get run by immigrants.
Yeah.
Because they have no safety net and they're starting up from scratch. And there's essentially two things that are happening. There's the guy behind the counter, and then it's normally his wife who's at the till. And, so you've got the person who's managing the finances and the other person who's managing the inventory.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as you're selling your inventory at a higher price than you got it for, you have a business. And you can apply that spaza shop model to every single business. The point at which you end up spending money in any business, if the money that you're spending is not going to be increasing the profitability, then you shouldn't be spending the money. So if you apply that mindset, no matter what business you go into, you'll be able to make it work if you can understand the basics of what actually drives that. So the useful thing for me is that I'd go into a business where I know absolutely nothing about it. So the time that we started ETV, I knew nothing about television. But there was a huge advantage that I had, that I knew nothing about television. And that meant that every time someone told me, this is the way in which we do things, I would say, why? And then they'd say, well, because that's the way that we've always done it. And then I'd say, but what about if you do it this way? And
usually they'd shout and scream and kick and wail, but they'd go, oh, well,
Yeah.
maybe. And sometimes it would work out better your way.
well, more often than not, it did. So, I ended up with a situation with ETV News at the time. So there'd be people at that who'd be working in the news department, and I'd say, I want something done in this particular way. And the person who'd be sitting behind the desk say, no, that can't be done. And so I would say, get up from the chair, and I would sit down at the chair and do it. And then I turn around and say, now, why do I need you? Which didn't bring me many friends at the time.
I mean, there are a lot of people in media who really don't like me and who don't like you. But as Julius Malema once said to me, but there are more who like you and there are more who like me. You've done in media, print media,
Yes.
IOL, you were in charge there for a little bit.
I wasn't in charge of IOL, so
What was your exact designation? You were head of corporate affairs.
no, that is
Oh no, sorry,
that
managing editor of the Cape Times.
yes,
Okay.
yeah, that was during
All right.
the
And new enterprises manager at independent newspapers.
yes. So that was so I spearheaded independent newspapers going into radio. So I was part of the startup team of Kaya FM. So
Yeah.
I was on the first
And YFM.
on the first board of Kaya FM. Well, I went to YFM after the fact, so I went and rescued YFM at the point at which it was tanking financially. But
Right.
So we also launched soccer magazines from point of view of independent newspapers back then. So Amakosi, the Brazilians, the Mighty Birds, those titles all kind of fell under me. We had the Star and SA Times International, which was essentially a free sheet for South Africans in London that we used to produce.
Wow.
So that was when I was Jean-Jacques Cornish's boss because he was editor of that back then.
Right.
Yeah. So, fairly substantial background in print. I drew up the first business plan for the Daily Sun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was Dion Duplessis' brainchild. He was my boss at the time. And I drew up the business plan, and we went and presented it to the Independent Newspapers Board. And they said, nah, it'll never work. Crazy idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so that was the point at which I then went back into journalism, became managing editor of the Cape Times, and then I hopped across to ETV, at which point Dion then gave me a call. He said, but I've got the money. Let's go do this thing. And I said, Dion, I can't, because I've signed up with ETV. And of course, the Daily Sun became the biggest newspaper success story ever.
Absolutely.
selling
Any
500,000.
regrets?
No, I mean, I regret the fact that Dion's not with us anymore. I was deeply fond of the guy. What a phenomenal talent.
Yeah, there's a lot of untold stuff in the media story of South Africa. And you told me about IOL and then ETV, and radio is such an important part of that. First time I ever heard about you was when you were at YFM, because obviously I was in radio at the same time, so I was paying attention to that stuff. But the story of YFM is a great story, and there are lots of people involved. But you were there to watch some of the most cool things happen that had happened in independent radio.
Yes.
Probably since 702 was launched.
Yes, very much so. And there was a lot of cutting-edge stuff that we ended up doing. But I think the single thing that happened at YFM under my watch was the training program. So I put in place the Y Academy, and I personally ended up training 252 people during the course of the 10 years that I was there.
Jeez.
And they're all some of the biggest names that you have in radio today. Well, I remember you had that conversation with a bunch of the former YFM people. So you had, I think you had Fresh there and Greg Maloka and a bunch of others, and I think they were all telling you about the Y Academy and the amazing stuff that we ended up doing.
Okay, so you left there, and since then, I mean, you've really done a whole cornucopia of things, including, as I hinted at, the political party. The other thing about you that I've admired is that you don't look at any of these experiences and go, well, that was massively successful, this one was a failure. You look at all of them as being compounded into a totality of experience, which gives you the courage to go and try new adventures. And when you look at the political party, you obviously didn't get the seat in Parliament that we were hoping for. I mean, I voted for you. But it wasn't a waste of time.
No, not at all. And, well, I think, all of us who were involved at the time put in a fair amount of our time into it. And of course,
including your wife and like lots of cool
I mean,
people.
there was real money that got put into it. I mean, I've forked out 250,000 out of my own pocket for
just to register.
Yeah, for the election deposit. And again, I have no regrets at all at having done that, because what we were trying to do was to actually shift the conversation away from the doom and gloom stuff and actually focus on solutions. And I think to a large extent that actually kickstarted a lot of stuff in terms of how people began
Have any of the political parties that are still around acknowledged that you gave them any ideas? Because some of them have been using some of your ideas.
Yeah, they have.
They have?
Yes. So I mean, Musi is very quick to, come up with a 10-point plan and all of that kind of stuff, which is still on the ZACP website, by the way, if you go
Right. So you can see it there if you don't believe us.
and check it out. But again, the point was we were very happy to have people steal the ideas.
Sure.
And it was kind of difficult to explain this to people. So, I'll use the YFM example at the training program. The kids, so there'd be 12 kids at a time that would be on the program. And I would walk them through everything in terms of the business. I'd take them through finances. I'd take them through business models. I'd tell them our strategic plans. And many of them would ask, they'd say, aren't you afraid that someone's going to take these ideas and steal them and use them?
Or steal the talent once you've trained them.
Yeah, but that was built into the program because we train people at a faster rate.
In fact, you wanted that.
Yeah.
For them.
Yeah. Oh. Train people at a faster rate so that the industry keeps absorbing them. But they used to say, are you not afraid someone's going to steal these ideas? And I'd say, well, by the time they start implementing these ideas,
you're already far ahead.
We're already far ahead, and we're implementing the next batch of ideas. And really what we want is for people to start picking up these ideas and claiming them for themselves and hopefully doing better things with them than we're doing. Because that's really how we grow as a country, right? It's not like, we grow the pie. It's not we all sharing the same pie.
Yeah, and that brings us to your latest project, which is this book. And you're giving very solid advice to anyone who wants to read it about how to fix South Africa. And a lot of this stuff is stuff you've spoken about on the show with me, with Pumi. But this idea of self-reliance and of resilience is, I think, a very common South African theme.
Yes.
We like to solve our own problems.
Yes.
We're not actually a nation that just sits and waits for things to happen.
I think look at one of the things about the interesting legacy of apartheid was that it did create among the Boers at the time a great sense of self-reliance. So a lot of stuff that could no longer be obtained from outside the country actually got done inside the country just simply because, needs must. I mean, so Sasol, for example, would never have come about if not for sanctions. You take the same viewpoint and you look in terms of what's happened in the recent past. So Israel, one of the reasons why I'm let's leave the Netanyahu's politics aside and let's leave morality discussions of the war aside. But let's look at the psychological makeup of Israelis and their quest for self-sufficiency and their ability to invent new technologies.
It's
this thing about
profound.
Making the desert bloom. Just
profound.
Yes, the fact that you have a country in the desert that's a net exporter of food to the rest of the world, that in itself is a starting point. You look in terms of what's happened in the case of Russia, where the U.S. for the longest time said, "Oh, Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country."
Right, and they keep saying that the economy isn't actually; it's a third world economy and all that sort of thing. Yeah,
and you look at the astonishing range of stuff that's actually come out of that country. The fact of the matter is that the Russians are still the only people who are able to get an aircraft, to get a spacecraft up to the space station and then land it. Okay, so Elon has still been trying to work on that for quite a while. We still so the West still does splashdowns in the ocean and that type of stuff. But you look at the fact that the U.S. space program actually existed for the past 10 years because of the fact that the Russians were nice enough to allow them to piggyback on rides up there to the space station.
You don't believe in American exceptionalism?
Listen, I'm a great fan of the United States. I love that country, and it gave me an education,
right?
That I could never have dreamed of having otherwise, and made some of the best friends ever. It's a country that's lost its way culturally because of the fact that it's this divisive critical race theory that's pulled the country apart, much to a large extent as we're losing our way out here because we're race obsessed.
Yeah, that's it, and it's just such a zero-sum game. Like nobody wins from this stuff because the zero sum is zero.
Yes.
But it amazes me that time and time again, people like you are able to find positive solutions to very, very serious problems. And when you write a book, which is ambitious to say how to fix South Africa, you mean it.
I do, because all of the stuff that I'm putting forward there is. There are things that if we do these very basic things, it can immediately make a huge difference in the lives of people.
You didn't want to call it "Make South Africa Great Again."
I think greatness is kind of a moving target, this idea of greatness as being something that was in the past doesn't sit well with me. I don't know,
because we should ever be improving.
Yes,
and technically, that's the difference between a conservative and a reactionary, right? Is that
yes.
The reactionary, like those Buddha you saw in their ox wagons on your way to UNISA,
yes,
they want to take things backwards, whereas a conservative wants to keep things where they are and keep learning new things.
Yes,
and a liberal wants to
yeah.
change everything.
Yes,
and then a revolutionary just wants to burn it all down.
Yes, and we've seen how that ends up in so many parts of the world where things kind of fall apart.
What is your domestic life like? You have a wife and children. You love to cook. You are about as self-reliant as anyone I know. You have dogs. You have a snake.
Yes.
Talk me through this.
It's relatively boring. So one of the things that
sounds like the Garden of Eden.
One of the things that
one snake.
So there's a particular ritual that we're very big on, and that's the idea of the family sitting down around the dinner table and having dinner together. And I think the reason why that's important is it's a chance for everyone to actually come together and to have a conversation and
take an interest in each other.
Exactly.
You see so many people who are just so disconnected from their own families. No one's really caring about each other's lives. No one's particularly interested in what everyone does for a living. And that's where things unravel.
Well,
at that level, like that's where society is built.
Yes. Well, there are so many people who they will go home and plonk themselves in front of the TV and put a slice of pizza on their lap. And but we sit down at the table. There are knives and forks. We
do it properly.
We light candles. And it's just the sense of ritual. So most people say grace. We just light candles. We do raise our glasses and clink, and occasionally one of the kids would say, I'd like to drink to my having done 90% on my biology exam today, and so we all.
I've no doubt your children are getting 90% in their biology exams. But celebrating those small wins also with each other,
yes,
builds the kind of sense of either ambition, which is a very good thing to have, and or confidence that you'll need in the real world.
Very much so, and I think that those rituals actually become very important because you can then extend that to the way in which you engage with the rest of society. Because if you have that basic respect for your family structure, you then end up having a sense of respect that filters through to your larger community.
Well, that's why I think it's relevant to discuss it with you, because when you talk about fixing the big things, you got to start with the things that are within your control. And family is the number one building block for all of this.
Yes.
What kinds of adults do you want your children to be?
I hope they never stop learning. So I think that's probably the single biggest thing. I think, certainly in terms of all of my kids, they're very considerate in terms of their engagement with other people. So, and I use that, in the sense that they're respectful in terms of how they engage with other people. They're likely to help, and they'll help you carry packages. They'll open doors for you, and it's that very basic level
So
of.
they're basically not shits, is what you're saying.
I'd like to think that that fundamental level of politeness
Yes.
and
Yes.
is something
Decency.
But look,
Manners.
to a large extent, that's something that we have in common as South Africans. I'd like to think,
Yeah.
So it's like the Afrikaans kids who will call any older person or I get called malume or ntate, and
Yeah.
and I like that. It's showing a basic respect for the fabric of society, and I think that's actually the building blocks of a successful nation. Rather than the kind of stomping and screaming that some political parties, particularly wearing red berets, happen to do these days.
Because they didn't ever sit down for dinner, and they weren't able to tell their parents what they're up to.
Sure.
And they didn't have that grounding. Maybe I'm just
But also
speculating.
The idea of having conversations without taking it personally and shouting at each other, and it really is. It starts there.
I would love for you to be like everybody's lecturer. You talk about the students who taught radio. I'd love for you to just help people understand that arguing is actually a perfectly acceptable form of communication. And in fact, it could be the most valuable stuff you do. I love a good argument.
Yes.
We've got to learn to do that more. It's so nice to talk to you about this stuff, which really matters, because what are we going to do about Russia and the Ukraine, or Israel and Gaza? This is the stuff that I think makes people tick. So
Yes.
It's lovely to sit and talk to you about it. Thank you, Kanthan.